So I should start by saying thanks a lot, David. Thanks for that introduction as well. It's great to be here. It's great to be back in Wisconsin. I'm not too far away, and I was raised right down the road in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. So it's very good to be back. So today, for the next hour or so, I will tell you about how I view life, basically, how I view life as a laboratory, and how I think about measurement within the social sciences, and how I think about questions that I'd like to ask, and I'll show you basically how I try to answer these questions. Okay? So where I'm going to start today is I'm going to talk more broadly about measurement methods in the social sciences. Okay? From there, I will talk a little bit about topics that I'm currently working on. One topic revolves around education, as was mentioned. We'll talk about how to lower what's called the achievement gap. Why are there significant gaps still between minority students and majority students? I'll talk about ways in which and why women get paid less than men in the labor market. It's still a fact that for every dollar men earn in the labor market, women earn about 90 cents. We'll detail using field experiments why that might be the case. The third example, I'll talk about economic discrimination. And as a little twist here, I'll put forward a question: what 7 words can end economic discrimination? Okay? And at the end, I'll wrap up with a conclusion about where I see field experiments going and why we should be using them more broadly within the social sciences. Now, I want to urge you, I'd like to run this like a Chicago seminar. Has anyone heard of how a Chicago seminar is run? Okay, so the first time I was in Chicago, I had 73 slides for an hour and a half, and they allowed me to get through 13 of them. Okay, so I have about 50 slides here, but if you have any questions as I go along, please ask. If I say something that you do not agree with, please challenge me. I think it's better to have a two-way conversation rather than a one-way conversation. Okay? So a good place to start is to look at 2 giants in the field, Paul Samuelson and William Nordhaus, and think about how did they view using experiments within economics. Okay, here's exactly what they said. The economic world is very, very complicated, and we know that. The real world is very complicated. They say one possible way to figure out what's going on is to be like a chemist or a physicist or a biologist and run an experiment. But then they go on to say in this seminal Principles of Economics book, which millions of students have read, including me. I read Samuelson as a student. Economists have no such luxury when testing economic laws. They cannot perform the controlled tests that biologists and chemists perform. Rather, they just need to observe data and model it to try to learn about the economic system. That has been where economists have been for decades. Okay? What I'm trying to do is move us from that statement, which is completely wrong, and show you how we can be data generators within economics and the social sciences more broadly. Okay? But with that as background, there's a sense of understanding why economists go about answering the questions the way they do. Here's essentially what they do. They have an idea or a problem. They race back to their office and they write down a model. And then they download mounds and mounds of data, beat up the data in an effort to make a causal statement. Do abortion laws affect crime? What did Steve do in that paper? He looked across states and said those states who gave you the right to have an abortion, they had lower crime rates in 15 or 20 years. He beat up mounds and mounds of data in an effort to make that causal statement. Okay, so that's essentially where economists are, and this is something I call modeling naturally occurring data. Steve's approach was to use the DID, or the difference in difference approach. There are a lot of ways to beat up data. Instrumental variables, PSM, structural modeling. In all of them, you are imposing a set of very, very restrictive assumptions. Many times they're implausible. But you do so because the gold standard within the social sciences is to go beyond a correlational analysis and to say something causal. Okay? So let's think about how does this approach play out within the area of education. This is the first opening my laptop session. So what you do is you would write down an objective function. You'd put achievement, and I'm not going to take a stand on how we want to measure achievement. You can measure achievement however you would like. Standardized test scores, absenteeism, grades, in-school suspensions, etc. Okay, you would make that a function of the various inputs of the actors. How hard do students try? How many hours do their parents work with them? And then you'd also have school inputs, and you would complete that by putting prices in there. Okay, so once you have that, you can use business principles. You can think about marginal benefits and marginal costs. So what people have then done is they've said, okay, just within this variable S, or the school inputs, should we hire better teachers or give them merit pay bonuses, or should we have classrooms that have fewer students in them? It's an interesting question to ask. If you're a student of the education literature, what you will find is that there's this very famous Coleman Report written in 1966 that came out with a very shocking result. And it said that students had bigger gains if they were placed in classrooms that had more students. And the idea was, well, there are more people to have larger peer effects around. That's how they rationalized it. In the end of the day, that result was completely wrong. The reason why it was wrong is because there were unobservables that the better teachers, you know what school districts did? They placed the best teachers in the largest size classrooms. They also placed the best students in the largest size classrooms. So this was a variable that was unobserved that the econometrician missed when he made his mounds and mounds of assumptions that led to this larger size classrooms lead to more gains. Okay? Now, you can say, well, where do we go then if we make these common mistakes when we analyze naturally occurring data? The extreme point is to run a lab experiment. Okay? How many people in here have taken part in a lab experiment in psychology or in economics? Raise your hand really high. A lot of you. You know exactly what this looks like. You have a classroom or an experimental or psychological lab, and you bring in a bunch of students, and you place them in a very artificial setting. And you ask them questions, or you pay them to perform make various choices. That's a typical lab experiment. And this is coming right from the Harrison and List paper, which your dean mentioned. Okay, so this is a way we think about the first step as a conventional lab experiment. Now, when I was working in the White House, I was really trying to push the work of Danny Kahneman and Dick Thaler that suggested that willingness to pay statements of value were much lower than willingness to accept statements of value. It's called the endowment effect or prospect theory or loss aversion, which we'll come back to. We were revising the benefit cost guidelines in the White House, and I was arguing that we should really take account of these lab results, because these lab results show that willingness to accept is always much greater than willingness to pay. So we should account for that when making these benefit cost guidelines. Here's exactly what a major White House official told me, and unfortunately I can't tell you who that White House official is because of confidentiality. Even though these results appear prevalent, they are suspiciously drawn by methods similar to scientific numerology because of students who are not real people. Okay, so that's a typical argument that you hear. I do a bunch of lab experiments, but what you typically hear is, well, they're artificial because students aren't the real decision makers. So that's where Harrison and I started, and we basically say, look, the first step outside of the lab is to run what we call an artifactual field experiment. It's artificial in the sense that it's in the classroom, but you go out and you collect the group of people who you're interested in exploring their behavior. It could be Costa Rican CEOs. It could be Chicago Board of Trade traders. It could be Apple executives. It could be White House officials. I've done artifactual field experiments along all these dimensions. Okay, but you still might say, well, wait a second. It's still artificial in the sense that they come into the classroom and they're making very artificial decisions. Okay, so Harrison and I say the next step towards reality is to run what's called a framed field experiment. Here you begin to add naturalness in the context, in the choice decision. You actually go to a market and you have people make decisions within the market, but they still know that they're taking part in an experiment. Okay, so it's still artificial in the sense that people know that they're being observed. And we know that the act of observation affects that which is observed. Various people call this a Hawthorne effect. Some people call it the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Okay? So the last step, and this is what the dean mentioned, it's one thing that I've been very aggressive in running, is what we call a natural field experiment. You actually go to the market of interest and you use randomization. You might be thinking, well, what assumptions is John making when he runs the experiment? He said these other methods, you need a lot of assumptions, which you do. You need one assumption when you run an experiment, and that's that you have proper randomization. So in a natural field experiment, I go to a natural setting, and I randomly put people in treatment and control without them even knowing that they're taking part in an experiment. And in that way, I have randomization to identify my causal treatment effect, and I have realism, because I'm in the actual market rather than the lab. I'm in the market where people actually make those decisions. And to me, that's the end of this field experimental frontier, because now I have realism and I have randomization. So I have the best of both worlds when I run a natural field experiment. Okay? So let's go ahead and now the opening my laptop will include an example of an artifactual field experiment, a framed field experiment, and a natural field experiment. Okay? So let's start with a framed field experiment, and this will go back to education. Now, when I think about education, I started thinking about it only 5 years ago, so I am not an expert in education. I'm an expert in experimental design, and I'm learning as fast as I can about education. But one statistic that policymakers often bring up is how much money do we spend per student? And what I've placed up here is I've placed US with a bunch of other OECD countries, and you can see in the first column here, we spend a lot of money in relation to our peer countries. So what makes people in America angry is exactly what do we get out of these expenditures. And as you can see here, I have reading, math, science, and graduation rate. And I can say this because I'm 25% Hungarian. We're down with Hungary when it comes to our outputs. So everyone will agree we are spending a ton of money, and our outputs are down here with countries in which we really don't want to be associated with in rankings like this. We would rather look like Korea or Finland. Okay? Now you can dig into the data and you can say, what exactly is driving these trends in the US? It's all about our urban schools. Why we do so poorly is centered on these urban settings, which typically have less than 50% high school graduation rate. In Chicago public schools, we have roughly a 47% graduation rate. Every 100 kids that start 9th grade, about 47 make it out with a high school diploma. You have the modal 9th graders reading at a 3rd or 4th grade level. You have math and science tests at the very lowest percentiles. And that represents a lot of kids. And it ends up then looking like a race issue. Because who is primarily in the urban settings? African American and Hispanic students. Okay, and then that leads to this racial achievement gap that I mentioned earlier. Now, what am I doing here? We've essentially set up a laboratory in Chicago Heights. It was very nice. At lunch, there was a fellow here from Chicago Heights, which was really nice. Chicago Heights, where is it? Chicago Heights is right down here, straight south of Chicago. Now, what I have here, this is sort of interesting in its own right. I have the distribution of racial and ethnic groups around Chicago, and as you can see, it's very diverse. But it's diverse in the sense that whites live here, Hispanics here, you have blacks again here, and you have whites here. So in Chicago, there's a lot of diversity in the city, but in the pockets, you tend to have people of these various races living next to each other. Down here in Chicago Heights, you have all of this, but in a very, very small area. So that's where we've been running field experiments for the last 5 years to try to figure out insights about the education production function. So we're using field experimental methods to learn about the education production function rather than taking secondary data and beating it up. Okay? This is a brush of what the current 9th grade class in Chicago Heights. This is our histogram of IRL scores. And as you can see, the modal student reads at about the 4th grade level. Okay, so it's just amazing to me that these are 9th graders and they tend to be reading at 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade level in our 2 Chicago Heights high schools. Okay, so then you can back up and say, let's introduce behavioral economics, and can behavioral economics help? And where I'm going to start is I'm going to start with loss aversion. Has anyone ever heard of loss aversion? Students for sure, right? Behavioral economics is a big buzzword. So here's my only bit of complexity in the entire talk. So what I have here is a value function. This is your status quo right here. So this is where you start. So we say if we move you up 1 unit, this is the gain. Or if we move you down 1 unit, this is the loss. So it's concave in gain space, convex in loss space. That leads to losses being more acutely felt compared to comparable gains. That's all loss aversion is. That losses hurt you more than comparable gains help you. So you can say, how can we leverage that behavioral economics insight? Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in 2002 by modeling loss aversion. How can we take that insight and learn about the education production function and help to lessen the racial achievement gap? Okay? So here's how. Right now in Chicago, a big discussion revolves around whether teachers should be paid in part with merit pay. Studies so far have found, there have been 2 studies so far, they have both found that merit pay does not work. Merit pay does not influence any outcomes that we care about amongst teachers. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to go into Chicago Heights. We're going to randomize teachers into incentive schemes, and there are roughly 170 teachers, and this will be results from a 2-year study, randomizing these teachers into various incentive schemes. Okay? If their students achieve, they could earn as much as $8,000, and on average, they will earn about $4,000, which is about 8% of their annual salary. So that's the scope that we're talking about here. Now, when we come in there, Teachers know that they're taking part in an experiment. That's why I'm calling this a framed field experiment. Okay, the only thing we're going to do here is we're going to put them in either a control group, which is you receive no incentive, a typical incentive treatment, which is at the beginning of the year we tell you what the bonus scheme is, and if you achieve, we will pay you at the end of the year. So in June, we will write you the check. That's how bonuses are always done. Or let's say 99.999% of the time, that's how they're done. In the loss treatment, what we will do is we will cut them a check for the expected value of the reward. So in September, we will give them a check for $4,000. And we will tell them, if your students achieve, you can keep that $4,000, maybe even earn more. If they do not achieve, you have to give us some of that money back. Okay, that's the only difference between the loss and the gain frame, is it's simple framing manipulation. Okay? So again, everything's the same. Size of the reward, criteria for earning the reward, time frame. It's just that you get paid at a different point in time. So this is budget neutral. Okay, here's what happens. This is in standard deviations. This is a racial achievement gap here. So the difference between the average white student and the average black student. This is what happened with the gain domain. It's not different from the control. The control is normalized to 0 here. So this is consistent with all the other studies that have been done. But here's what happens in the loss treatment. You increase by between 0.2 and 0.25 standard deviations. So just by having your student in the classroom where a teacher is given the bonus up front and threatened to take it away, they increase by nearly as large, so it's only about, let's say, 0.07 standard deviations different from the racial achievement gap, just by simply framing the message using loss aversion. Okay? So you might ask, well, can that work with students? Now you can do the same sort of experiment. But here we go in the morning of the test. Okay, so students do not even know that there will be an incentive coming. The morning of the test, they show up at the test room. We put them in one of these 4 groups. In group 1, students are paid $1 if their test score improves from the fall to the spring. They're paid $1. Here, they're paid $20 if their test score improves from the fall to the spring. Here, we actually give them $20 and put it on their desk and tell them you can keep it if your test score improves from fall to spring. If it doesn't, we will take it away right after the test, because we have a way to score the test immediately. And in the control group, again, we have students who are paid nothing. This might be the cleanest test of loss aversion. Literally give them the money the morning of the test so they don't have time to study. So this should be a minimum bound of how effective loss aversion can be. Here's what happens. This is the average improvement in grade levels now. So just by giving them the $20, they improve their test scores by nearly a half of a grade level, just through that loss aversion treatment. That gives you a sense of how important effort is on these standardized tests. And exactly what does a standardized test measure? This gives you a sense of what it measures. A lot of the racial achievement gap is about effort. It's about effort when you're sitting and taking that test. And this shows you the power of loss aversion in that these other ones don't really, in fact, the $1 treatment actually is perverse. That's consistent with a lot of behavioral results. If you pay someone, you better pay them enough or don't pay at all. Okay? $20 gain, it worked okay, but nothing like the budget neutral $20 loss. Okay? Any questions about those 2 studies before I move on to the artifactual field experiment? Go ahead. I think so. I really do. So we do have studies now. Our first step in the business world was to go to a Chinese manufacturing plant and take the idea of just framing the message when you will be paid this reward, beginning a period versus end, and we can get roughly a 2.5% increase in productivity on the manufacturing line from doing that. Executives, nobody's given me the chance to experiment with executives yet, but I suspect that it should work just as well as it has in these other settings. I think it's very good if you can change someone's status quo, and then there's a real chance to go in the negative, the third quadrant. That will make people work harder. I think that psychological insight that's used here is correct. And I think it will work at every level, but I do not have empirical evidence for anyone beyond Chicago Heights schools and Chinese manufacturing plant, which has 20,000 workers. And that's a paper that's coming out in a journal called Management Science, the Chinese manufacturing plant one. Any other questions on this before I move on? Or you could save it till the end. Go ahead. Yeah, so with certainty, people have more of an incentive to cheat, no doubt. In the teacher experiment, we actually administered the ISAT tests themselves. In these were not ISAT, that's why I can't norm it, but standard deviations. We administered these as well. But there is more of an incentive to cheat, no doubt. There's more of an incentive to try harder. There's more of an incentive to do all you can not to lose that money. Absolutely. Somebody else back here had their hand up. Go ahead.
A point of clarification. So is this the gain for everyone on standard deviation?
This is the average gain.
So could you see if there were differences in gains by different
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this community has 90% Hispanic and African American kids and 10% Caucasians. This result, in general, you won't find heterogeneous treatment effects within these, but I think that this will generalize to the best school districts in northern Chicago? No, because I think those students are already at their frontiers. I think they already recognize that these are important tests, and they try as hard as they can. I think these types of tricks, the teacher I'm not sure, but for sure at the student level, these types of students are not near their frontier, and this shows you just how important effort is. So I think this generalizes to other urban settings. I don't think it generalizes to settings where school kids are maxed out already. Yes, go ahead.
Is there a diminishing effect when you repeat the
Yeah, so that's a good question. So on the teacher data, we only have 2 years of data. In those 2 years, there was not a diminishing effect. Here, we did these over also a 2-year period, and then we took away the incentives, and we observed how these students did after the incentives were taken away. Some theories in psychology would say, after you incent someone, then they're going to try harder during the experiment, but after you take it away, their intrinsic motives will be crowded out, and then it will lead to inferior outcomes in the long run. That doesn't happen in these data, I think in part because very few of these students actually have intrinsic motives to do well in school. But I do think that could happen in other types of settings. Okay, let's go on. It's 4:10 already, so I'm going to move here to, let's give a summary. Now, I've just picked out a few results from this literature that I've contributed. But when you step back and think, we've now done 50 experiments like that, and we've done some very large-scale experiments as well. What have we found about the education production function? CH and S are very strong complements. So when you have a study that just incents one of those components, that study will not reveal very large effects just because of the complementarity in the production function. Okay? What we also find is that in these communities, parents are extremely important, much more important than anyone would ever realize until you actually look at these data. Now, what's also clear is that it's hard to find game changers that are durable. So I've given you things that are very short run. But what about interventions that might last a lifetime? So that's where this Griffin Foundation gift of $10 million comes from. We've actually started our own preschools. And we have our own standalone buildings where we're intervening in 3, 4, and 5-year-olds' lives, and we're trying to figure out what are the best ways to lower the racial achievement gap by intervening when kids are 3, 4, and 5 years old. And that's something called the Griffin Early Childhood Center, which we don't have time to talk about today, but I think that's the real deep intervention that we're doing down in Chicago Heights right now, where we're touching roughly 1,500 kids per year, and we're in the 4th year of that program. Okay, so let's go to an example of an artifactual field experiment and ask the question, why are men paid more money than women in labor markets? Okay, you might first step back and say, well, what is the evidence for that claim? Let's first of all establish that men are indeed paid more than women. So one way to look at it would be to look at the percentage gap between median men's and women's earnings or wages. Here's Korea here, so that tells you that men earn nearly 40% more the median man compared to the median woman. The OECD average is about 17.6%. The US is a bit above the OECD average. So if you just look at the raw wage data, for every dollar that men earn, women earn about 80 cents. Those are just in the data. Okay? You can look at other moments of the distribution too. You can look at unemployment levels. Women are much more frequently unemployed compared to men. You can look at the very highest echelons of corporations, CEOs. There's a severe underrepresentation of women at the very highest levels of corporations. Okay? So you can say, well, wait a second, let's get mounds and mounds of data and beat it up. Okay, so these are the data that I just told you about the raw female-male wage ratio. And as you can see, since 79 to 2000, it's lessened. It's lessened from about 68% up to about 80%. So the gap has gotten smaller. So let's say we adjust for the amount of schooling, what's called human capital, or the number of hours worked. Many times women like to take time out of the labor force to rear their children, much more often than men. Okay, that regression just shifts up to here, and then we can add occupational characteristics, and we have the difference of about 90 cents on the dollar. Okay, so we can control for all the differences that we know between men and women, what jobs they're in, their human capital, how much time they take out of the labor force. We still find that women earn about 90 cents on the dollar compared to men. So our idea is, what about preferences for competition? Okay, so what do I mean by that? There's recent work in experimental economics that suggests that men are more competitively inclined than women. And what do they do to make that inference from that or make that interpretation? They bring a group of students into the lab and they have them complete a task, let's say solving anagrams, which, by the way, women are better than men at solving anagrams, statistically. So they bring a group of people in and they tell them, you can either choose incentive scheme 1 or incentive scheme 2. In incentive scheme 1, for every anagram you solve, we will give you $1. If you choose incentive scheme 2, we will pay you $3 if you solve more anagrams than a random person in this room. If you don't solve more, you will receive nothing. That's the simple experiment that people do to try to explore competitiveness. Okay, and here's what they find. This is the fraction that choose to compete. Whether it's in a female-dominated task or a male-dominated task, this is shooting free throws. What people find is that men, which is the blue bar here, men choose to compete much more often than women. Okay, so that's sort of become a stylized fact. This could be one more reason why we have a gender gap in pay. Just because differences and preferences for competition or negotiations. The aggressiveness to go after a raise or a promotion. Okay? So when I first saw that, I thought, well, this is really interesting. If that is true, I wonder if it's due to sex or gender. And gender being your sex and then what society tells you to be. Now, I'm not going to make any more strong statements here because I know a fellow at Harvard that got himself in a little bit of trouble by making statements about right tails and left tails, etc., okay? Let's just leave this as an open empirical question. Is this sex or gender? So if you'd entertain a straw man hypothesis, then I can test it. On average, in every society, men are more competitively inclined than women. Okay, that's the straw man hypothesis that I want to test today. Now I can do that if I go to two very different societies and do more or less an existence proof, existence experiment. I want to go to a matrilineal society and a patriarchal society and do similar type of experiments and explore preferences for competition amongst men and women in those two very different types of societies. Okay? So the first society, a patriarchal society, we're going to go to Tanzania. And in Tanzania, this is a very, very brutal society for women. As we were talking about at lunch, this is a Maasai tribe. Has anyone heard about the Maasai tribe in Tanzania? Okay. Very brutal for women. Women are a commodity. In fact, when we were there, the trading rate was 7 head of cattle for 1 woman. Most men have multiple wives. Okay? On the other end of the spectrum is a matrilineal society in India that we approach the Kasi society. Has anyone heard of the Kasi society? Okay, what happens here, if you knock on the door, this is what we were talking about this at lunch as well. You knock on the door of a Kasi household, the man will answer, escort you in to his wife, he will go sit in the corner and not say a word, and she will talk to you about issues of the day. All of the wealth in the Kasi society runs through the youngest female. If you have enough money to send one of your children to school, and you have a boy and a girl, with certainty, you send the girl to school. I don't know if there are any Seinfeld fans, but it's like Bizarro World. Remember when there was a Jerry and it's almost like that. You drive around the Kasi society, there are billboards that men have put up arguing that they deserve equal rights. It really is an amazing society. So here are just a few anecdotes. A Kasi man says, "We are sick of playing the roles of breeding bulls and babysitters." Okay. Now, usually at this point, some guy in the audience says, "I wouldn't mind playing that role." Okay, but that's the way men feel in the Kasi society, and many of the men, not all, of course. And women, of course, are a commodity. Now, the question is when you go to these societies, what tasks should you use? People in these societies have a very hard time thinking conceptually. Women in the Maasai society will not pick up a pencil. So when we got there, we thought long and hard. We want to do a task that they typically do not perform because we want an initial inclination of a preference for competitiveness. We ended up choosing this task. That's a tennis ball in his hand, by the way, okay, that he's trying to throw into a bucket, which is 3 meters away. Okay, so we did a very simple experiment. You have 10 tries. You can choose one of 2 payment schemes. Payment scheme 1, you receive 50 cents for every successful try. 50 cents is about 2 weeks' worth of wages in both societies. If you choose to compete, you will receive $1.50 per successful try should you make more balls than a competitor. We left the competitors gender neutral. That's a different experimental parameter that you could think about using. We didn't use that here. Okay, so that's our simple experiment. Why do I call this an artifactual field experiment? It's very artificial. People in these societies do not sit around throwing balls in a bucket. Until we went back 2 years later, guess what? There were a bunch of expert ball throwers. 9 out of 10 every time they could make them. Then we had to come up with a new task. Okay, but at the time, people don't sit around throwing balls in a bucket that has sand in it. Okay, so very artificial. But it's artificial because I want to test in as clean of a way as possible my straw man hypothesis. Okay? So here's what happens in Tanzania. Men competed at a rate of 50%, women 25%. Very, very similar to what happens in the US and Western Europe. We act a lot like men and women in Tanzania. What's going to happen when I click it, you think? How many people think you will still have men competing a lot more than women? Please raise your hand and indulge me. Quite a few. How many people think that the two bars will be about the same height? How many people think that these two bars will reverse? That's exactly what happens. Now, what we find when we run bargaining experiments, we go to the markets where Cassie men and women typically deal day to day, and we do natural field experiments when they do not even know that they're taking part in an experiment. Their women bargain like our men. Their men bargain like our women. Happens in this experiment. It happens experiment after experiment after experiment. Now you can say, well, what does that mean? So we can have some very speculative interpretations. Cassie's society removes these very important barriers so women can express their true preferences. Look, like I said, right down the road when I was at Sacred Hearts in Sun Prairie, whenever I did not compete as much as I should have as a first grader, you can guess what my gym teacher told me. List, stop playing like a girl. Probably can't say that anymore, but that's exactly how I was raised. That's probably exactly how most people in here were raised. We are told from the moment that we are born, we are told how we should behave. If women compete too much in our society, they're called something. If men don't compete enough, they're called something. This gives you a hint, I believe, at how important socialization and how important a role that socialization can play. You could say, well, another speculative interpretation is that the Cassie Society allows competitive women to earn greater rewards in the labor market. That's a very Chicago type of explanation. Then they can pass on their wealth to their daughters, and they're more likely to mate. I can't rule that out either. Now, what we have done is we've gone back and replicated, and now we are taking biological markers, testosterone levels, to try to figure out if there is something biologically different between these societies and trying to determine why that's the case.